I'm delighted to be here with our fantastic panel today to look at proof of concept, what it means, and how we can use that to create big solutions for big problems, but do it in a way that allows us to move swiftly, to learn fast, and to take an intelligent approach to understanding and managing risk. So I would like to welcome our panel today. We have Paul Cofield from the Cabinet Office, who's been involved with the Digi Inventors project. We've got Dr. Rachel Sutherland from the NHS, who's been involved in a fascinating data driven project that sounds like it's going to add huge value. And we have Mark Elliott, Programme Director for CivTech in Scotland, which is a really relevant organisation to be here today. So to kick us off, I'd like to start with an easy question, I think, I hope, which is what proof of concept as an approach has meant to each of our panel today in real terms for the projects they've been involved with. If I could start with Rachel, please.
So obviously, on a daily basis, and it's never been more apparent within the NHS over the last couple of years, that we have a certain amount of resource. And specifically when we talk about IT, it's always felt like it's somebody else's problem. We're going to end up with everything being scratched off, and we'll end up with it looking fairly imminently like it's something out of Grey's Anatomy, and we'll all be walking around with, digital touchscreen devices. And this has been the case since I've been in training, and I started in the early millennium, and I've still not materialized with a touch screen that does everything I want it to do. And so proof of concept was about actually the really niggly things that bother us on a day-to-day basis, how we start to take little bites off this bigger and almost unwieldy kind of issue that frustrates frontline clinicians and nursing team members on a day-to-day basis. So our project was really simple in that we were starting a brand new service, and we wanted to integrate just some really straightforward logistical metrics that would then help us build some clinical metrics. And this little thing called COVID happened. So all the analysts had been taken away to go and do lots of COVID work. And I live in an area of Edinburgh where there's an awful lot of people with data skills, and everybody was sat in their houses, sort of many on furlough. And so I was moaning, obviously, on Zoom, might have been with some wine, some friends, and somebody mentioned the Scottish Tech Army. I thought, there's this actual people who are trying to mobilise and actually help you guys with this. And so I went with initially like 5 problems, and they helped me to evolve my proof of concept to something that, wasn't unwieldy and that was manageable and deliverable, but also then we could use that to process to scale. And then when our analysts came back into the room, we were able to just give them this piece of work, which we've then been able to run with. So it was, lots of things happened in a nice, happy way for us to take advantage. But I think it was really getting a team of people, and it was the Scottish Tech Army team of people, to help us define that proof of concept so that it was a manageable and deliverable thing. And so I think my first thing to say about proof of concept is you do need help with your proof of concept. You might go in there with what you think is a great idea, but you need help to define what it is.
Thank you. I suppose it's one of the unique things about unique and slightly positive things in some ways about the last couple of years that it gave us access to volunteers with that level of expertise and experience and commitment in a way that was unique and hadn't happened before. I will come back in a second. Paul, if I could come to you next, and then Mark, I want to bring you in.
Yeah, so I guess that going on from what Rachel said, of having access to the people to help bring the proof of concept, that's exactly what I brought to the Digi Inventors project. The students in that instance had an idea, they had a bunch of images of the different screens for how they wanted to present their solution. What I did with them then was take them through the process I would go through to actually create a proof of concept, to bring together some kind of usable, clickable prototype that takes the images from their PowerPoint and puts it onto something that they could look at on their phone. And the moment I showed them how that worked, you could see their eyes lighting up. And that, I think, is one of the bits, for me, it always comes back to the proof of concept approach things visualizes the idea or the communication. It brings it to a point where everybody's looking at the same thing. So you've got that kind of common point of interest that there's no uncertainty about what we're talking about, because things have moved to something which is has an element of tangibleness to it, which takes it from just being the idea. Because when you're talking in ideas, the four of us could all be talking about the same thing and actually have completely different ideas of what that same thing is. And we're all human, so that's to be expected. I've been in the fortunate position of being one of the volunteers with the Scottish Tech Army to be able to take those skills and bring that to a bunch of different projects. I'm also working with the volunteer app, to help volunteers within the Tech Army. So in that instance, the proof of concept becomes a thing that the developers can look at. I think, all right, okay, so we understand what data needs to be moved back and forth through the process to make this happen. It adds in, from my perspective, obviously I'm an interaction designer, so it adds in the consideration of interaction. What's it like to go through the process? What process do you expect as a user to go through? So, I mean, I'm trying to wrap myself up here, because otherwise I'll just keep on spouting on. This is literally, this is my world. I think I'm maybe a proof of concept. Yeah, I mean, I literally eat, sleep, and breathe doing this stuff. So, yeah,
It's
I'll stop
great.
there.
I know, Paul, it's wonderful to hear that passion, and it is just making me think about the fact that the what Scottish Tech Army brought to the table over the last couple of years is really unique. There is something different there that I don't think we've ever had the opportunity to tap into in quite the same way before. And I'm sure some of the projects you've worked with, and certainly the students and the international students you worked with on the Digi program, to be able to work directly with somebody like you that doesn't have the typical associated budgets or timescales involved is hugely valuable in itself. Mark, it's a different model with CivTech, but it's also a groundbreaking model, and it's a model that's got a real focus on innovation and that intelligent approach to problem solving. How do you approach this?
I think, well, let's. I'm going to go the other way, and I'm going to talk about why CivTech came into being. CivTech, for those of you who don't know, is its mission is to drive daring and innovation in the public sector by collaboratively solving problems to make people's lives better, and in doing so, create generations of high growth potential businesses. Now, the reason it came about was because, one, some people asked why governments, the biggest sector in the world, the public sector, had not embraced the kind of methodologies that had revolutionized so many other sectors. The Silicon Valley, for want of better methodologies, are things like tech accelerators and open challenges. Other people were asking why it was that the heartland of innovation was so different, SMEs, individuals, rarely large companies, was so difficult to get hold of for the public sector. And it all kind of came together. And against this backdrop, or against this is the backdrop of the brutal facts about IT projects over the last 30 years. And I'm going to read them out, because every time I look at these numbers, I just go, what? 71% of large IT projects, be they in the public sector or the private sector, fail in one way or another. That's research over 30 years. It's indisputable. 20% fail completely, and 5% get stopped before they even start, before they even get to the finish. And great examples are, and I'm sorry to mention this because we've got somebody, an NHS colleague here, is the NHS database. £11 billion and counting before it was stopped. And it will never see the light of day. the BBC Media Manager, which I've seen various estimates of how much it cost. The lowest one was 134 million, and that will never see the light of day. And if, in case you think it's a British problem only, my personal favorite is the American Defense Department's $6 billion over 8 years for a battle-hardened communication system to come to the conclusion that the iPhone 4S was better. Now, these are all huge projects going big straight away. Now, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think, hang on a second, maybe we should start small and start and build. There are other, you know, there are other ones. I mean, smart cities. Oh, please don't get me going on smart cities. You know, why would you want to do a project at that size when you could take a small community and go from there? So, proof of concepts are first stage in a gradual development process, which will go through. You know, in terms of tech, or in terms of Silicon Valley tech, you'd go to an accelerator, you create a minimum viable product, which isn't so different to a proof of concept. It's a bit further down the line, and that's the system we use at Civtec. And we fast fail people. I'm not a fan of fast failing. I'm a fan
Fast learning.
Well, I'm a fan of fast development, and if it leads to failure, fine, but then you learn fast. And personally, I'm a bigger fan of fast success, but there you go. But you know, it's a staged process, and nobody in their right minds starts large. They start small, they figure it out. The longer you can spend on paper, the better, metaphorically, obviously. And you know, only make those staged interventions. You know, projects inside the Scottish government, you know, or in any government, can cost millions the second they get going. Civtec, you're risking a few £1,000s, but at the end of it, you know whether it's going to work or not.
Yeah. No, sorry, I'm smiling because as somebody that spent a large part of their career in a global technology company, I've seen both sides of the fence on that one, and I'm going to firmly sit on it, not comment there. What do you think in terms of what Mark's just described as well? And obviously, I'm chief exec of an NDPB now, and I spend quite a lot of time persuading people that it's okay to take risks, you know, managed risks, intelligent risks, and that's acceptable. That's, you know, we need to do that. We need to do that to move forward and innovate. But for you, Rachel, what was the biggest barrier to overcome to get people to move forward with this?
So I think the big thing we are in the NHS is time poor. So the biggest, I can't knit hours of the day. If I could, I would. And I guess it's also that leap of time to explain to people what you're doing. And ours was purposefully low risk because it didn't actually cost anybody anything, the project that we did, other than, you know, it became my hobby during lockdown, essentially. I got paid a little, you know, I get a proportion of my time for this. You know, I'm the data lead for our department. So I get 4 hours a week for it. But as you can imagine, you know, we're a department that have, you know, upwards of 12,000 patients through a year. So you imagine the data that's starting to come out of that. So, you know, it's about accepting the level that you're going to get to, and keeping people, you know, the nice thing was the Scottish Tech Army, because they could see where we were going. And the person I was working with, Neil, who was the helping me with the requirements and the data side of things, we were quite happy rolling on. Be like, oh, I'm off on holiday next week, Neil, or oh God, it's been a terrible week for COVID this week, Neil. You know, and we were just understanding. Whereas if you were in a company, you know, like Mark describes, it could have failed because of that time input, because the expert wasn't able to put the time into. So whilst I agree, you need to fail fast and sometimes move on, but sometimes you need to understand about the resourcing of it. And I think it's taken, you know, this dashboard has been in delivery within our unit for 6 to 8 months. It's only now that we are reaping the clinical rewards of that, and it's helping us to develop and evolve the clinical service. So you've also got to, you know, you've got to enable it to embed so people can trust it, that it's working. So time, I think, is the critical thing. And I'm very evangelical about it, but ultimately I can be as evangelical as I like. People need to see an output that's meaningful. So then that can only happen with time.
Yes, yeah, that tangible value that it's beginning to demonstrate, and that then opens doors to do other things. But the time poor element, I think, is a really critical one, and obviously in the NHS, you're frontline and about saving people's lives. So anything that's not core to that must be a challenge to manage, especially in current circumstances. Paul, from the other side, um, from the side of the volunteer, what's the biggest challenge you've faced in terms of the proof of concept model and moving that through?
I think it's probably the other way around, in that there isn't really so many challenges, because I'm being the person who is, the voice for that, taking that approach. That the difficulty in my day to day is the kind of the mindset is different to what people are used to. So the time poorness comes into it because the methodology doesn't quite align to it. So people they don't know how to apportion time within it. From the volunteering side of things, because I'm the one bringing that perspective, I've put it in place, like we're doing it. It's kind of there by design rather than having to fight for it. So you almost get to jump to the maturity level that things should be at for that to be how things are done. Whereas again, when you're part of a larger moving machine, reaching that level of maturity can take time.
Significant time. So I suppose the volunteering approach brings a certain amount of freedom.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. Yeah, I do. That's a really interesting point. I like that. Mark, to come back to you and to come back to CivTech, we started by saying we were going to be looking at how we create big solutions for big problems. What can we learn from the CivTech model as well as the Tech Army one?
A lot, probably. I think one of it relates to a point that's just been made is that I think culturally getting people to understand that that's the smartest way of doing things, particularly in a digital world, is really important, and it's taken us a while to break through.
Yeah.
So I've been at CivTech since the get-go. I took over as the program director on CivTech so I've been program director for 3 years. And I remember the last event we did was probably the last government event before lockdown. And I stood on stage and I said to people, look, I hope by the end of this you'll start to think that digital is a must-have, not a nice to have, because that was definitely the way people thought about it. I don't think I think, again, one of the sort of silver linings to this awful tragedy we've had over the last 2 years has been that people get that now. And I think that people are beginning to go, okay, if we're going to do digital, we need to understand this weird agile thing that they keep talking about. That's the thing we've got to keep remember. We're all in a bit of a bubble, in truth. I hate the word, but one way or another, we're all techies. And we think it's normal to do agile. We think it's normal to fast fail. It's not. It's not. We've had 70 years of waterfall inside governments and large organizations, and we're breaking down 70 years of behavior. We're talking to people who've gained their senior position for 40 years of crawling up the waterfall process. And we're asking them to take away the ladder they've been walking on. It's really difficult. It's a huge culture change. CivTech's mission is to drive daring and innovation. It's culture change. We happen to be exempling it through all the challenges we're doing. But we're still facing people are going, can't we do waterfall? Can't we solution? You say one of the things we do is we say to organizations that come to us, you know your problem, don't solutionize. That's the problem. Don't solutionize, set the challenge statement and let others figure it out. And you still get people going, yeah, but we know what we want. And you go, no, you don't, because you don't know what's out there.
Yeah. That's a hugely good point, and I'm smiling because 20 years ago that was a bit of a mantra when I was still working in the industry was don't solutionize, just tell us your problem, tell us your challenge. And Rachel, I could see you nodding there when Mark was talking about culture change as well. Is that something you recognise?
Well, it's a huge issue for us. As you can imagine, the NHS is an unwieldy organisation, and it has very little for incentivisation to promote innovative ways of working. And I would say that we actually disincentivise doing something new and different, and the culture is really risk averse. And I think there's a need to conceptualize the cost of that risk averse culture of trying something new. And I think that ties back to this idea of the need to do small change, proof of concept it, and build rapidly, because there's a lot of these solutions that are seen as external things, whereas actually we as sort of individuals within units and for patients can actually create small meaningful change that can build from there, because many of us are facing the same issues. So when the Scottish Tech Army helped me build this digital data dashboard, Scotland, the Scottish government are planning on rolling out this sort of type of work called same-day emergency care. It'll probably have 10 different acronyms by the end of it. And believe me, the doctors have had a lot of fun trying to make some quite entertaining acronyms like focused on scheduled care, but nobody wanted to go for that. But, you can see how, data is quite agnostic. You can call the unit whatever you want, but if you're seeing this type of patient, if we define what your data feeds are, you can take that away. And, and they, that unit can use the work you've done and build on it. So the other big thing that I think is this sharing of concept ideas. And that's another big thing that's happening with Twitter, with all these things. We're much better at everybody, in Scotland in acute medicine is on a WhatsApp group, most of the consultants, and they'll go, I'm having this problem with this. And so actually, you're sharing that burden of issue, but you're also sharing a little bit of solution, but a little bit of building that groundswell of culturally, we can't just carry on moaning about it. We've got to do something, and how do we do it? The challenge that we have is we spend 5 years in university, but we don't necessarily build many of the skills that are needed in terms of the project work, and we actually don't necessarily know how to interface. Our multidisciplinary team that we see is a nurse, a doctor, a radiologist, and actually we need to have that view of a different multidisciplinary team, which involves your data analyst and your electronic patient record system. And you need those people all in a room together. And it all sort of comes back to communication and it's that culture again. So I absolutely hear what Mark's saying. You don't really want to sit down and solution develop. You want to sit down and develop that culture of communication so that you can all work together and create change that way. And I think the NHS is making movement towards that, but it's really difficult because this is, I as a doctor in Scotland will begin my training and work in the NHS, and it depends on when I'm able to retire, but anywhere between a 40 and an 80-year career now. So, actually you need those vessels to train and develop people.
That's fascinating. It's the point, the interdisciplinary piece is fascinating, and the idea that actually still fundamentally much of this comes down to communication, whether it's enabled by technology or not. Paul, would you like to comment on anything you've heard Rachel and Mark say there, and then Mark, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, so I mean, like the change bit of it kind of comes back to what Mark was saying about, everybody's used to waterfall. That approach to things works beyond digital. So it's like the multidisciplinary team within the hospital takes the waterfall approach through the way things go, because that's what works in that context. So there is a lot more, I guess, the diverse other industries are much more grounded in that outlook. So the change factor of it, the whole having to just do things differently and think about it differently, that and alone, regardless of the context, that's quite intimidating to most people. I kind of think that as someone who works in digital, change is the constant. I'm almost like the bringer of change. I crowned the UX team when I was at Visit Scotland as the 4 horse people of the apocalypse, because we just seemed to bring bad news to everybody. But that was their response, was that it was a bad thing, because they were too entrenched in the way that things are and have been, and don't have the same, at that point, didn't have the same time to kind of look beyond and look at the what if, as well as the like, what's the danger if we don't change? Where does it start to fall away?
I'm going to take that I'm going to take that one with me. That was brilliant. And I think you are absolutely right. Change is pretty much our only constant, and it's frightening for people, but often the not doing it actually is much more terrifying in the longer run. Mark, if I can come back to you and get some thoughts.
Well, just talking about acronyms,
Yeah.
we're being pushed to be the Public Sector Innovation Centre of Excellence. Just worked that one out. Psycho. But I think one of the, people talk about the risks and what have you. I guess I've got 2 reflections. One is, what's the risk of doing things differently? Well, the risk is not doing something differently, because if we carry on, the old definition that they claim Einstein coined, but he didn't actually. But that idea of you constantly do the same thing, you constantly get the same result, but you're expecting something different is a definition of insanity. And this has tended to happen over the years. I think for me, I think we've just got to be absolutely certain that we're going to continue chipping away at this. It is a culture change. It will take years. It'll take many years. Equally, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that agile isn't the solution to everything. Not to mix metaphors or sort of get too close. I'm quite pleased the water supply companies use waterfall methodology when they actually put water into my tap, because I like to think that it's been gathered sensibly, purified, and sent through pipes that work. And that's a very waterfall process, and you're not going to get the water unless it's been purified and everything. So there are places for everything, and I don't think we need to become too evangelistic about it, if you like. I guess the other thing is that what we often say at CivTech is that if you want to get innovation, you need 3 things. You need people who know what the problem is, and Rachel would be a great example of that. She's an expert in her area. I mean, come on, she knows what the problem is, and she knows all the background to it. You need people who can offer solutions. Scottish Tech Army is a great example. We have a policy of going out to anybody. You don't have to be a company to apply to CivTech, and there's a real rub on that in terms of if you look at the number of people in consultancies as opposed to the people in the country, and you do wonder why anybody ever uses a consultancy. And you need people who understand the nature of innovation, who can marry those 2 things, and that's what CivTech does. We're neither experts in areas nor digital experts or tech coders or techies in that sense. But we get innovation. We know how innovation works. I've been involved in innovation since I was a kid, because my father was an innovator and an inventor. He called himself an engineer. I grew up blowing up garages, thinking everybody did it. It was a combustible innovation. Let's put it that way. So I think you need 3 things in the room, and I think you need the courage to fail. I think that's probably the better way of looking at it. Believing in what you do, and having the courage to fail, and actually having the courage to say, you know what, we didn't get it right. Let's go again.
Yeah. Mark, I think that's an absolutely brilliant summary that rounds up the discussion incredibly succinctly and really neatly. I also think that the panel we've had today are a brilliant example of what can be achieved, whether as the owner, the expert owner of the problem, one of the expert volunteers that helps to solve that problem, or leading an organization like CivTech that's brought innovation to the public sector in a way that challenges us, but also gives us huge leaps forward in the way we can solve those collaborative, collective problems. I think Scottish Tech Army, as we know, has been a model that's also opened doors to solve problems we wouldn't have been able to tackle otherwise. And as we said, if there's small glimpses of light and positivity that have come out of the last 2 years, then I definitely think our panel today have shared real tangible examples of that, with collaboration and innovation at the heart of it all. Thank you very much to the panel today, Dr. Rachel Sutherland, Paul Caulfield, and Mark Elliott. Thank you.
Thank you.